Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us today for the Farm Foundation Forum Reviving Rural: Agriculture as the Heartbeat of Healthy Communities. I'm Tim Brennan, Vice President of Programs and Strategic Impact here at Farm Foundation, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. It's a pleasure to present today's forum in collaboration with our friends at the American Farmland Trust. Thank you all for joining us today. A very special thank you as well goes out to Farm Credit for their generous support in helping make this important conversation possible. I'd like to take a moment to recognize our event partner, the American Farmland Trust. AFT leads the conservation agricultural movement with a mission to protect farmland, promote sound farming practices, and keep farmers on the land. Through advocacy, research, hands-on work, the organization has helped save millions of acres and supported thousands of farmers in adopting sustainable practices. Their well-known message, no food or no farms, no food, reminds us of the importance of their work. I'm looking forward to today's discussion in which we'll explore how agriculture can serve as a catalyst for revitalizing rural communities, strengthening local economies, improving health outcomes, and building long-term resilience in the face of change. I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in a farming community in northeastern Ohio that had seen better days. Farm consolidation, population loss, brain drain, and other economic factors made our town of 600 people no more than a footnote in local history books. The farm crisis of the 1980s put an end to any hope of economic recovery for my town and most of our county. Today, I live in a farming community about 35 miles south of Chicago, and the threats are a little different here. While agriculture makes up 85% of the land use in our town, farmland is looked at as simply land that's waiting to be developed. The soil is not seen as a precious resource, and our farmers are not valued for all that they bring to the table in our community. I think we can and must change these perceptions, and today we'll talk about why and what will happen if we don't. But before we get into today's program, I'd like to take just a few minutes to share a bit more about Farm Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we're an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating people and ideas into action. The three levers we use to accomplish this are policy, innovation, and education. Forums such as today are just one part of our extensive program of work, which is guided by our mission to build trust and understanding at the intersection of agriculture and society, and our vision to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. We rely on partnerships and coalitions to fund our work and increase our impact. So if you're interested in learning more about partnering with us, I encourage you to please reach out. I'd now like to take a moment to highlight our Friends of Farm Foundation program. With your enrollment as a friend, you'll not only be helping support the mission and vision of Farm Foundation, but you'll also gain exclusive benefits such as first reads of our issue reports, networking opportunities, and much more. Being a friend is an investment in building a better future for our farmers, our communities, and our world. To learn more about being a friend of Farm Foundation, go to farmfoundation.org/friends, and the link is also being posted in the chat. In addition to learning more about Farm Foundation, I encourage you to connect with us on our social media platforms. If you're posting on social media as well about this morning's sessions, we ask that you please use the hashtag Farm Foundation Forum. Before we start the Farm Foundation Forum today, we have a few housekeeping notes. There will be an audience question and answer session at the end of today's presentations. We'll use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and not the chat to queue those questions. This forum is being recorded and it'll be posted on our website at farmfoundation.org as well as on our YouTube channel, and we'll send out a link for that after today's program. When the forum concludes, you'll also receive a link for a brief survey. We appreciate your feedback and the time in completing that survey. Now, let's turn to today's forum. I'd like to start off our conversation with our first panelist, Julia Friedgood. Julia is a senior fellow and senior program advisor at the American Farmland Trust and a prominent national expert in farmland protection, land tenure and access, agricultural viability, and food system planning. She focuses on planning and policy frameworks that support farmers and ranchers and advance equitable, resilient food systems to increase food security and address climate change. Julia also contributes to research, extension, and community engagement projects. We're glad to welcome you today, Julia. It's all yours.
There I am. Thank you, Tim. And good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Today, I'm going to give a very brief introduction of AFT, a little background to set up how we got to where we are, talk about opportunities that I see for agriculture to support and improve the health and wealth of rural communities, and the strategy that I use to bring communities together to chart a course for a healthier and more prosperous future. Next slide. There we go. So as Tim said, AFT, American Farmland Trust, we're a nonprofit. We were started in 1980. Our holistic mission is to save the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, advancing sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. We're scale neutral, and while we pride ourselves as launching a national conservation agriculture movement, we're best known for our efforts to raise public awareness through our No Farms, No Food campaign. As you can see, and you've probably seen our bumper sticker, even if you don't know who we are. I've been at AFT for 35 years, working across and integrating our mission areas through research, technical assistance, program and policy development. But I'm most passionate about bringing these together in communities on the ground and looking for ways to create regional systems, infrastructure, and support. Next slide. So I'm sure this audience knows how much agriculture is influenced by federal policy, especially the Farm Bill, which has shaped the landscape of farming and rural life for nearly a century. State and local policy, where I spend a lot of my time, is often driven by or in response to federal policies. Since the 1970s, farm policy has focused on increasing agricultural productivity and exporting commodities around the world. Nixon's ag secretary, for any of you who are as old as I am, remember this, Earl Butz famously said, "Get big or get out." He also said, "Plant fence row to fence row," but that's a little different now. Since then, these kind of priorities have profoundly affected agriculture and what's happened in rural America. Next slide. So the good news is in the second half of the last century, these policies really did succeed, and agriculture significantly increased production and distribution efficiencies and achieved a much cheaper and more diverse food supply. As you can see in the chart on the slide, total farm output nearly tripled. Well, I guess that's not on the slide, but between 1948 and 2019, and food prices fell, which is what you do see on the chart, especially for food prepared at home. It may surprise people, certainly surprises my children, but today, on average, most consumers only spend about 10% of their disposable income on food. That's even with the recent inflationary uptick, more eating out, and eating a whole lot more than we used to. A Pew Research study found we eat about 23% more today than we did in 1970. Next slide. So that progress was great, and we all benefit from it, but it came with consequences, and they threaten both the sustainability and the resilience of agriculture and rural communities. These range from environmental degradation to an increase in diet-related diseases. I'm going to focus on the loss of farms and the hollowing out of many rural communities, which has led to shrinking populations, declining institutions like hospitals and banks, and per capita, the highest rates of food insecurity in the country. Next slide. So again, as you see on this slide, I find this chart incredibly revealing. At the sort of peak of agriculture in terms of number of farms in this country, we had about 7 million in 1935, but the average farm size was only 155 acres. Since then, that number has dropped by 72%, and farm size nearly tripled. The immediate decline, that big drop you see in blue on the slide, was so dramatic that USDA described it as a free fall situation leading to trauma. Since then, the drive for large, technology-dependent, specialized farms continues with substantial consolidation in farm sales. By the 2022 census, farm numbers had dropped to 1.8 million, down about 8% from 2017, farming an average of 466 acres. Land and farms also continue to slow decline from a peak of about 1.2 billion acres to 880 million acres today, but that is a story for another presentation. Next slide. So as you can see, kind of the result of these policies is the light blue in the chart. 4% of large family farms operate on nearly a third of American farmland and contribute nearly half of the value of production. What you can't see in this slide is that 1% of very large farms contribute 42% of the value of production. These very large farms have gross cash farm income of at least $5 million, and they operate on an average of 4,673 acres, 100 times the average in the country. This kind of consolidation is what's changing the face of rural America. As you can also see in the kind of yellow and green colors, is that most farms are small and mid-sized family farms. Together, they operate on just under 60% of the land, and they generate 35% of the value of production. They're the bedrock of many local and rural communities, and their decline has reduced the diversity of food supply chains and led to declining employment and economic opportunity, rural depopulation, and the loss of things like hospitals, schools, and banks. But we can turn this around. Oh, yep, that's right. You can go to the next slide. COVID was a horrible, traumatic event, I think, for many of us in this country, but it also was a really important wake-up call. It was like the canary in the mine. And when the pandemic hit, consumers and at least some policymakers were shocked to find empty shelves at supermarkets. The country as a whole was not prepared for disruptions along the food supply chain and the sudden surge in home cooking. This exposed vulnerabilities in our food systems, but it also revealed opportunities for innovation and change. Next slide. So communities, and there's been a lot of research on this now, but communities with established local and regional food systems pivoted quickly to fill gaps and leverage social networks or local networks to meet production, processing, and marketing needs. This was really true in New England, where I live, a region that isn't known for its agriculture, but we do have a lot of small farms. And it was remarkable how quickly our local farmers stepped up to take care of communities. The process has to be reciprocal. When communities come together to sustain local farms and give them the support that they need to thrive, it can help revive rural America. Next slide. So it's been very well documented that having many small and mid-sized farms contributes substantially to rural vitality. Doesn't mean there aren't other ways for agriculture to revive rural communities, but it's a good place to start. These farmers have long been associated with a civically engaged middle class, more equitable distribution of wealth. They tend to be diversified. They tend to produce differentiated products. They buy livestock, equipment, supplies, and all kinds of things locally. They employ local people. And working with them to find markets, add value to their products, and leverage opportunities in local and regional food systems can both stimulate rural revitalization and, given rural rates of food insecurity, improve health outcomes. Next slide. So there's been lots of research that's found that local and regional food systems retain more revenue in a community compared to commodity supply chains. This generates a positive economic ripple effect or a multiplier, which benefits other local businesses and improves rural prosperity. It also makes communities more resilient to shocks and disruptions, reducing reliance on global supply chains, and promoting community food security. And finally, when there are more farmers in a community, it provides more room for social interaction and community building amongst them, reducing the isolation that often comes with agriculture, and with it, stress and loneliness. So, next slide. So I believe the solution to these problems lies in community engagement and action. I do a lot of what we call planning for agriculture at AFT in various ways, from standalone plans to focusing on agriculture in comprehensive or master plans, to uplifting rural agriculture and food systems plans. Connecting the community, especially farmers and ranchers, through a planning or community development process and resulting actions is incredibly impactful. But it can be hard to wrap our heads around a whole system. So I love the community capitals framework shown in this slide. It was created by Jan Flora and Cornelia Flora Butler and includes 7 capitals or community assets: human, social, political, financial, built, natural, and cultural. Can be used to identify and leverage local assets to create opportunities, respond to needs, and build wealth. It's especially useful in rural communities that feel stymied by their lack of tax base, because it lifts up other assets like abundant natural resources and close-knit community ties. It's really useful. If you haven't used it, I really recommend it. Next slide. So while I've been emphasizing the role of small and mid-sized farms, I don't want to diminish the importance of large commodity farms. As I said in my introduction, AFT is scale neutral, and thanks to 50 or more years of federal policy, large and very large farms are the only sector that's growing. But too much consolidation can lead to a concentration of poverty and food insecurity in rural communities, especially when other economic opportunities are scarce. So if we can enhance agriculture by sustaining and in some cases restoring diversity in scale in farm country, we can support the health and wealth of rural communities. But it won't happen on its own. There's no silver bullet. There's, no magic sauce. Every community is unique. Strategies have to be built from the ground up with local leadership and based on community aspirations and needs. But I've worked in dozens of communities, from Maine to Ohio to Illinois, to Idaho to California, like all over the country. And I know, and New Mexico. Hands off to you. So I know it's possible. And to do that, next slide. I've developed this graphic, which kind of shows the process that I like to use, because it's an iterative process. That's why I show it in a spiral. It's not like it's linear and you start at one place and you end at another. It keeps revolving around as time goes on, but it's grounded in community engagement, informed by research and assessment, driven by shared community goals and values and vision, vetted along the way, results in action, and it has metrics to adjust tactics as needed to achieve the community's vision and goals. But it's got to be driven by engagement. It's got to be focused on assets, not deficits, and it's got to move towards achievable outcomes. Many processes are based on a SWOT analysis. They take a problem-solving approach, a kind of Chicken Little approach. But I've found that too much attention to deficits discourages action. So I prefer what I call the little engine that could approach the I think I can, chugga-lugga, building on assets and moving towards achievable outcomes. And so next slide. So with that, I think I'm out of time. Want to thank you so much. If you want to learn more, I do have a book, which about half the book is sort of what communities can do and the tools they can use. And the other half is to kind of set up some of the things that I've said today. If you want to get in touch with me, there's my contact information. And Tim, thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. That was fantastic. And I have to endorse Julia's book. I have a dog-eared copy that lays next to my computer. I use literally all the time. And you can get it on Amazon. It's terrific. Julia, I think my favorite phrase of what you said was scale neutral. And I think that that is so important that we think about that all of the time. There is room for all sizes of operations, and those operations depend on each other. So thanks so much for that. Next, we're going to hear from Xochitl Torres Small, who served as the 15th Deputy Secretary of Agriculture. Previously, she worked as Undersecretary for Rural Development and as a U.S. Representative for New Mexico's 2nd District. Her work has focused on rural prosperity, infrastructure, equitable food systems, and solutions for water in the West. She has also led efforts to expand rural broadband, improve healthcare access, and strengthen economic opportunities. It's great to have you here with us, Xochitl. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Tim, and hello, everyone. Good morning from Taos, New Mexico, where I can attest to the importance of rural communities, rural vitality, and agriculture as a fundamental heartbeat of that. A lot of my comments could just be interpreted as a +1 to what you just heard from Julia. I'm going to try to fill out that picture with a couple of stories. As Congresswoman for New Mexico's 2nd Congressional District, when I served that district, it was the largest district that wasn't its own state. So there were a lot of rural roads, dirt roads, and rural hospitals. And I ended up spending a lot of my time communicating to colleagues about why rural matters. And hopefully this audience doesn't need that, but we've certainly seen across the country this increasing divide where folks don't understand the value of each other's work. And that's why these kinds of conversations are so crucial. So the way that I talked about how and why we support agriculture specifically is that, of course, our farmers feed our country. And it's crucial that our food be affordable, that it can be healthy, and that we can access it everywhere in our country, close to home. That also means that we have to support the people and the places that feed us. And increasingly, as Julia mentioned, starting with the Nixon administration and on, we've also focused on feeding the world, sometimes using food as diplomacy and finding a way to show our agricultural practices to help feed countries in need. Because we will always need food. And so we have to learn to acknowledge and recognize each other's work. So hopefully you all know how much rural matters. Now let's talk about the strategy of supporting it so that agriculture can continue to be that foundational heartbeat for thriving, resilient rural people and communities. You know, one of the pieces from Julia's presentation that I most appreciated was that focus on assets, not deficits. And the way I put it is that local people know what makes a place special. And the way you can build resiliency is intentionally building a marketplace around that. Now, we're going to focus on ag, but that also counts whether we're talking about minerals, oil and gas, or other energy production, whether it's manufacturing and using land where that's close to interstates or border ports to facilitate that, outdoor recreation, and wind and solar energy, other spaces for economic development. This conversation isn't about being pro or anti any of those and being size neutral, but it is looking at how each of those sectors and each type of ag can help achieve rural vitality and resiliency and what's necessary to support that. And so I have a look of 4 different ways to look at that. 1, does it support real good jobs in a community? 2, can it serve as a multiplier for jobs, not just in one sector, but other sectors? 3, is it supporting sustainability for the long haul, not just the immediate season? And 4, and this is sometimes the hardest, does it maintain the essence of a community? So first, real jobs in a community. With lower margins and increased automation, how can farms support more good-paying jobs in rural areas? And I'll tell a quick story about a ranch in Florida that purported to be the largest ranch in the nation. It was a cow-calf operation. And on its operation, because it was so big, they were able to dedicate some land specifically not just for ranching, but also for a John Deere testing ground, where they were able to work out kinks that might have been in certain manufacturers, certain equipment, and to make sure that it really worked in application. Because of that need, they were able to advocate for high-speed internet and support the community, not just the ranch, in getting that high-speed internet. And while I was with them, I was talking to the ranch manager and I said, okay, it's clear that you are contributing to the community in lots of different ways, bringing in folks for training for this John Deere equipment, getting high-speed internet. But let me talk to you about why small farms matter too. And he said, you don't have to sell me on that. I know that that's crucial, whether it's about making sure that there are lots of kids for my kids to have classmates in their school, to having trained ranch hands because they grow up with that experience, to making sure that we can get healthcare close to home because there's enough people to support that. So it's clear that agriculture can be a fundamental part of good jobs and supporting a community. But it can also serve as a job multiplier. So the question is, when does farming create new jobs within the ag sector and beyond? Last year, I had the chance to visit Wisconsin and to visit DRAM, which is a family-owned company that started out with sprinkler heads. They were working with nurseries to provide a sprinkler that kind of drenched the ground in a slower way to provide for more growth and support the soil. But then they were able to diversify because of the huge need, because of the farms in the surrounding areas, but also because of an incredible resource, which is a lot of fish near the Great Lakes. They diversified into fish fertilizer that USDA was able to invest in to support the farms in the area, to support a broader local economy, and also to support the domestic production of fertilizer. So that's a great way, an example of how agriculture can be a multiplier. But I'll tell another one that's even outside of the agriculture industry. I had the chance to visit Schuyler, Nebraska. It was one of my favorite trips. For those of you who know the area, it's near several meat processing plants. And as I was walking down Main Street, I was struck by just how vibrant it was. There weren't those shuttered storefronts that you so often see, and it makes your heart break. Instead, it was filled with all sorts of businesses, and the businesses were interesting. There was a Mexican restaurant on the corner. There was a store whose literal name was African Store. And then there was this clothing store that had these beautiful prom dresses and purses, and also right next to traditional Guatemalan wear. And what I learned is that there were so many people who came to the community for the meat processing jobs. And as the family stayed, they invested in that community. I visited one of the restaurants that started out as a food truck serving those workers during the day, and then turned into a brick and mortar store that revived a restaurant that had been closed for several years. What was beautiful to see was that the community invested back. So they started inviting these entrepreneurs into the Chamber of Commerce. One of their signature annual events became Cinco de Mayo, which truly speaks to a combination of cultures. It's something that's really only celebrated in the US, but it was inviting for everyone to enjoy and celebrate. And they actually invested in translation services for their Chamber of Commerce meetings so that they could include all of the entrepreneurs. That's the kind of multiplying effect that can happen. One of the places where multiplying is most possible is in the tech sector. I talked about the DRAM Corporation and how innovation can both support farms and support a rural economy. But that doesn't always happen. And one of the key issues is that, Silicon Valley doesn't always understand agriculture and rural operations. And on the flip side of that, sometimes farmers can be really risk adverse in adopting tech. So we know there's a lot of investment in tech. In fact, in 2021, there was $18.2 billion invested in ag tech, and that's been shown to be at 38% year-on-year growth since 2013. But the slow adoption is fair. There was a recent farmer survey by McKinsey that found what common sense tells most of us. Most farmers in the US delay adoption because of the high cost of adoption. And then the second highest reason why they're reticent to take something on is because there's an unclear return on investment. And that's exceptionally challenging when margins for so many are so thin. In that same survey, farmers reported globally that input prices had risen between 80 to 250% in the last few years, and we've certainly seen those trends continue. So, likely the most successful technologies will be technologies that immediately reduce input costs and that create clear, immediate revenue opportunities. This is another example of why we need farms of all sizes, because as we've talked about how those multipliers can really happen with small farms, and as Julia talked about the resilience of communities as a result of the smaller farms, adoption for technology is more likely to happen with large farms first, who can use that economies of scale to cover those initial capital investments. So we certainly need everyone at the table. Third, the question is the long haul. I've said it before, we all need to eat. That's why we're all invested in long haul sustainability of our country's farms. But what are the challenges to that resiliency? Well, I don't have to go through the long list, but I'll say a few. High cost of labor, thin margins across the board, housing, healthcare, childcare, and increasing natural disasters and climate uncertainty. There are so many challenges. So what do solutions look like? I got the chance to visit Washington and the Snoqualmie Valley Farmers Cooperative. Initially, they were really struggling with scale, getting the right equipment to their farms, so they created a buyers club. And through that buyers club, they formed trust that allowed them to eventually form a cooperative where they were able to take on some of those biggest challenges. One of their biggest issues was workforce, and so they developed a training program for farm workers to be able to have a more sustainable supply. Um, I got to see what that looked like in the long term, because through that training and the relationships that were created from a reliable, consistent farm labor population, one farmer was actually able to build that into his succession planning. He was able to sell his strawberry farm to a former farm worker to be able to continue operations. Now, as we face the fact that over 40% of our nation's farmland is owned by people over 65, this type of succession planning is going to be fundamental to keeping agricultural land in operation into the future. And working together, farmers can help address some of those challenges. It's also crucial from a sustainability perspective. I recently read an article on Strauss Family Creamery, which is continuing to innovate with nature-based solutions. And one of those solutions is working to capture the methane from their lagoons. Now, they've always been in compliance with the environmental regulations, but they wanted to do more. And so they invested in these methane-eating microorganisms through Windfall Bio, where they were able to, the microorganisms would eat the methane and then produce nitrogen. And so immediately that gave them a new market, turning the nitrogen into fertilizer, and also potentially higher value milk through their collaboration with Whole Foods. So during this historically hard time for dairy farmers, Strauss Family Creamery is able to find a new way to expand their revenue. Lastly, I'll talk about essence. How can rural communities grow while maintaining that essence that makes them special in the first place? And I'll end with a story about how farmers are dealing with growth all across the country. I got to visit it with another Florida rancher, and very different from the large ranch that I started out talking about. He's a small, multi-generation rancher who used to specialize in citrus and beef. And then Disneyland came into town. And as they were buying out all the operations around him, because farmers were thinking about their family and wanting to be able to provide for the future, he decided to double down and invest in his farm. And so he continued to operate beef, held on to the citrus that he could despite disease, and diversified. He saw all the restaurants in town and started selling higher end beef by also including grass-fed beef on his farm. He also invested in his expertise by cultivating bull genetics and transporting and shipping those genetics all across the world. And then he realized there were new tourists coming into the area for Disneyland, and he wanted to provide exposure to a different slice of life. So he planted a blueberry U-pick farm where tourists are able to come and enjoy another part of Florida. So how do we make sure that agriculture continues to be the heartbeat of a community? It takes knowledge on the ground. We have to listen to farmers and community. We have to invest in research that will make sense for farmers to apply in the future. We have to recognize innovations and ideas, and we have to support as farmers look to plan and diversify so that they can take a risk that will turn into opportunities for themselves, for rural people, and for places across our country. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sochil. That was fantastic. I love this multiplier concept. It got me thinking to my own community, which just this year we opened the first new storefront in our downtown in probably 40 years. And we built the first new houses in our community since the real estate crash of 2008. And that multiplier effect was really one of the drivers. It was people there that had small businesses like a food truck that we're able to grow them into something bigger. But now we're out of storefronts. And so it's an interesting opportunity for our community to think about how the public and private folks can get together to create some of those spaces to allow small businesses to grow. So I love that concept. So thank you for sharing that. Thanks for the stories. That was really, really helpful. We're going to change our focus a little bit now with our next two speakers to focus on the health of rural communities, the citizens, the mental health, and those issues. And so we'll start with Alan Morgan. Alan is the CEO of the National Rural Health Association and is one of the nation's leading rural health policy experts. He's named among modern healthcare's 100th most influential people in healthcare. He brings more than 35 years of experience at the state and federal levels. He's a former congressional and gubernatorial staffer. He is also a published author and advocate with degrees from the University of Kansas and George Mason University. Thank you so much for joining us, Alan, and it's all yours.
Tim, thank you. And let's talk about my favorite topic, rural health. Different topic, but you're going to hear the same themes that you heard from the first two speakers. And we're going to keep this asset-based approach to rural. Now, that being said, I am going to open up talking about some of the challenges, and certainly ones that you're hearing in the national news right now. If you're following the news, or if you've been following it, rural health at all over the last 20 years, you realize that front and center of this discussion is unfortunately on rural hospital closures. And in fact, over the last decade, more than 190 rural hospitals have had to close their doors. That's in the past. Looking at our data right now, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but nearly a little bit over half of the nation's rural hospitals are currently operating at a loss. I'm going to say that once again because that data is just so astounding that half of the nation's rural hospitals are currently operating at a loss. I'm with the National Rural Health Association. If you care about rural America, there's a home for you in the NRHA. We have a broad-based membership organization. We included with our members are leaders within the small towns. You've got educators, you've got researchers. But mostly what we're known for is we represent more than 90% of the nation's rural hospitals, rural health clinics, and rural community health centers. So if you're practicing in healthcare, chances are really good you're a member of the National Rural Health Association. Now, there's a myth out there that these rural hospitals are closing because of declining life expectancies and because of workforce shortages. But everyone on this current call, and I looked at the attendance roster, you all know rural. So you all know where rural areas are currently experiencing declining populations. And if you look where the rural hospitals have closed over the last 20 years, you see that it is not in the areas where declining populations have happened. It's actually in the areas where you have a clustering of patients with high health needs and the inability to pay. That's why the current discussion at the national level on Medicaid is so very important. When you cluster patients with high health needs and the inability to pay, it forces these rural hospitals to pick up the bill. And in many cases, they simply aren't able to do that and keep their doors open. I mentioned workforce shortages too. I hear this so often, it frustrates me to no end. They're like, what's wrong with rural America? How do we address the workforce shortages? There is nothing wrong with rural America. Currently, less than 5% of incoming medical students come from a rural area. Less than 5% of the incoming medical students come from a rural area. So as a nation, we're taking upper income urban kids. They're going to school in urban areas. They're doing their residency in urban areas. And then we're dumbfounded. They don't want to practice in Flush, Kansas. That's just a crazy way to try to address workforce. Really, really important that we do a better job of growing our own and employing rural residency training programs. So that way we can keep our kids in the rural community and let them know that there's a home for them after they graduate and complete medical school as well, too. So what happens when you have declining access points of care with rural hospital closures and you have workforce shortages? Well, as a result of that, it creates a declining life expectancy in rural communities. So unfortunately, it's not unusual to see 20 years less in life expectancy in a rural community than you might see in the suburbs or an urban area. Now, that's a lot of challenges I laid out there. And the story that isn't being told properly about this is because of these challenges, it's forcing innovation. And I can tell you almost every major innovation in our healthcare system over the last 20 years has its roots in rural America. This challenge is creating innovation hubs across our small communities. In fact, if you want to see where healthcare is going to look like and how it's going to be accessed 20 years from now, simply go to a rural community today. You're going to see a high reliance on telehealth, on networking, and you're going to see healthcare providers working in a community basis to make sure that you have access to high quality healthcare services. Now, I mentioned the innovation that's currently happening. And in the past, we've seen concepts like patient navigators come up, community health workers. And of course, you can't talk about innovation in a rural context without talking about telehealth. The chance for telehealth to bring some of the state's top specialists into your local community, it really expands the access and is a force multiplier and a tool in addressing workforce shortages. In addition to that, we're seeing increased usage of remote patient monitoring, most notably utilizing wearable devices to allow patients to take care of their own health status, working in partnership with the primary care physician and many times a community health worker as well too. These are innovations that we're now seeing expanded into the urban context as well. Earlier, one of the speakers referenced quickly artificial intelligence. And I have to tell you, among our membership, we're seeing a rapid embrace of AI into the clinical practice. And let me be clear on this. One of the great time sucks that rural providers have is dealing with all the paperwork. Utilizing AI and documentation is freeing up hours of clinical time that primary care clinicians can now refocus back on their community. Again, I want to emphasize that use of telehealth, the use of remote patient monitoring, and the use of artificial intelligence. We're seeing all of these come together, and in many cases, you're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, greater and better care delivered in a primary care setting in a rural context than what you would see in an urban in many cases. Now, it's really important to note, you've heard a lot of cross-sector presentations so far, and you're going to hear more on this. And it's just so important to note that in most rural counties, healthcare represents the largest employer in those counties. So often we talk about economic development, healthcare is put off to the side and not realized, and there's a lack of recognition that these economic engines, in many cases in these counties, have the potential to drive the community. In fact, I might actually say on top of that, if you're looking at the data, those communities that have lost rural hospitals, oftentimes the community follows as a result of that. So that importance and reliance on rural hospitals and rural healthcare as economic engines to ensure the future for rural communities cannot be understated. Let me close really here on talking about the importance and the relevance of cross-sector approach and collaboration. At the federal level, the National Rural Health Association, we're in constant communication with Farmers Union, Farm Bureau, National Rural Electric Cooperative, the Rural Education Association, just to name a few. I want you to know at the federal level, we are constantly partnering because we recognize the importance of collaborating across sector. As a takeaway, I hope you all are doing that at the local and regional level as well, too. Healthcare, agriculture, small business, education, they all have a role to play together moving ahead. And it's really important to recognize the relevance and the importance for the access to healthcare to be able to keep our seniors in the community, to be able to keep our farmers and ranchers there doing the job they need to be done, and also hopefully expanding OB care and maternity care so that way we can attract young families into the communities and build a future for our rural America as well too. So with that very, very brief overview of what the top line issues we're thinking about in rural healthcare, I'm going to turn it back to the program and look forward to answering any Q&A at the end of this session.
Thanks so much, Alan, and really appreciate that your point of view. A question that I'll want to ask you later is the role of doctors coming from abroad, so immigrant doctors and their role in rural communities. Because I know certainly where I live, that's very much the case. That's how we have healthcare. So our final speaker today. Oh, by the way, I see lots of questions in the Q&A lining up. Thank you so much for that. Make sure you're putting your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat because we might not see them. So lots of great questions there, so keep them coming. But anyway, our final speaker for today is Jeff Whitten. Jeff is the founder and chairman of Rural Minds, a nonprofit dedicated to addressing mental health in rural America. After a personal family tragedy, Jeff became a passionate advocate for reducing stigma and improving access to care. A lifelong dairy farmer, Jeff also owns Wall Street Dairy LLC in Chautauqua County, New York. He leads a communications firms and serves on several Cornell University advisory boards. Jeff, it is all yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and I certainly would like to thank the Farm Foundation and the American Farmland Trust for inviting us to this very important conversation. I normally start such presentations with an apology in advance that you may hear cows in the background, but today I'm talking to you from a hotel in Chicago, so you may hear some other noises that normally aren't native to our dairy farm in New York. So I want to start my segment of this conversation with a family story. As Tim kindly pointed out, Rural Minds, which is a relatively new nonprofit organization, is a result of a tragedy that took place on my family farm back in 2012. So I'd like to take you back to that year in September specifically. It was a beautiful September day. Those of you who are familiar with upstate New York are aware that it's one of the most beautiful places, I must say, in the country, especially in the autumn. And my oldest nephew, Todd Jr., had gotten married, and it was a mountaintop experience, as we all say in farm families. He was the first in our farm family to get married. I'm from a very long line of dairy farmers, and I'm proud to be a dairy farmer still. So the wedding took place in a typical small town where our farm is of 500 people. And it was the quintessential wedding and wedding reception. The wedding photos have cows in the background, cornfields, and the reception was held at a rodeo grounds in our rural area off the shores of Lake Erie. And so as I was leaving my nephew's wedding reception, his oldest brother, Brooks, gave me a big hug, and he had his 3-year-old twins with him, as a little girl in one hand, as a little boy in the other, and said, "Uncle Jeff, I just want to thank you for everything you have done for me and for my family. I truly appreciate everything you've done." And I didn't think anything about it because my nephew Brooks was a very appreciative young man who always went out of his way to demonstrate his gratitude and appreciation for anything that anyone had done for them. So we departed the next morning, of course, typical dairy farming operation. We started at 5 that morning. At that point, we had 3 different farms in Western New York, which have all been consolidated now to one location. So I was in the process of driving from one farm to the next to just ensure everything was going okay. So as I was finished at the third farm and heading back to the main farm where I live, I approached my nephew Brooks's home that he shared with his 3-year-old twins and his fiancee. And as I approached his house, I saw a fire truck, I saw an ambulance, I saw police cars, I saw all kinds of things that I wasn't expecting, as you can imagine. So a woman that I had grown up in this small farming town with come running across the road as I pull my pickup truck into my nephew's driveway, and with tears coming down her eyes said, "Jeff, don't go any further. I just found Brooks in the backyard and he's unresponsive. I think he's dead." And I'm like, "Renell, what do you mean you think he's dead? I just saw him at his brother's wedding 2 days ago. I just talked to him yesterday. We were making plans of what we were going to do." And she said, "I don't know, but the police have called the coroner. He's on his way." Well, sure enough, the coroner came and determined my nephew had died, and it appeared he had died by suicide. As you can imagine, the rest of this story is one that was filled with sadness and regret and just questions that none of us could answer, because my nephew was such an outgoing, gregarious, seemingly very happy young man. There were no signs or signals whatsoever that he was struggling with mental illness. And he worked on our farm. I mean, he was there every single day. We were around him, and there were no signs whatsoever that he was suffering in silence. But what we did find out later is he left a note for his twins. Again, keep in mind they were 3 years old when he died, for when they were older, to try to explain why their daddy felt he had to leave them. And that's really all we knew. So the next day, we go to the small United Methodist Church in our farming community, sit down with the pastor to now start planning a funeral for a 28-year-old farmer and the father of 3-year-old twins, after having just celebrated his brother's wedding 2 days before. And the pastor looked at my brother, my nephew's father, looked at my mother, who had basically helped raise him, and looked at me and said, "I don't know how to tell you this, but there are people in this farming community that don't think you should talk about what your family member died of, what Brooks died of." He said, "I had somebody even suggest that maybe you say he died in a farming accident, or he died of a heart attack or something of that nature." And my mother, who is a true matriarch of our family, worked on our family farm, got up early in the morning and did the baby calves and took care of cleaning the milking equipment and all of those things that many dairy farming wives do. With tears running down her face, pounded her fist on the pastor's desk and said, "Pastor, this is going to stop with my family. This has been going on in this farming community way too long, and no one will admit what is happening. I am going to keep my grandson's memory alive by talking about this, starting at his funeral." So 2 days later, my 28-year-old nephew's funeral took place. There were hundreds and hundreds of people at the small church, standing room only, people out on the yard trying to listen because the church couldn't accommodate the outpouring of support my farm family had. And it wasn't just because my family has been farming in this area for many generations. It was because my nephew was literally bigger than life. Everybody loved my nephew Brooks. If you were having a down day, you wanted to be near him. So people came from far and wide to celebrate his life and to try to make sense of this. So I was asked to give the eulogy. As you can imagine, it wasn't an easy task to accomplish, but somehow, by the grace of God, I got through it. And after his funeral was over, we had other farm families lined up for hours to not only express their sympathies and their compassion and concern for my family, but to tell us their stories, stories that had been hidden for generations, stories that needed to be told, but stories that hadn't been told because people were embarrassed, they were ashamed, because mental illness is something that we do not talk about. And the floodgates opened, and that day, on September 3rd, 2012, the seeds for Rural Minds were planted. Now, because he left behind 3-year-old twins, we wanted to give the kids as much of a normal childhood as possible. So we waited a few years to launch Rural Minds. We only launched 3.5 years ago. We're not even 4 years old yet. But once the kids turn teenagers, and they're 16 and both driving now, which is, if you knew them, kind of a scary proposition. But they're great kids, and they're now part of the storytelling that we're doing as a result of Rural Minds being founded 3.5 years ago. I've had the good privilege of working in the healthcare industry for pretty much most of my career, in addition to dairy farming. So I worked for biopharmaceutical companies that had medicines for people living with mental illness. And so I thought I knew a lot about this. And I did have a lot of relationships with a lot of the other large mental health organizations. So I started reaching out to my contacts that I had made throughout my healthcare career and basically said, okay, you know me as corporate Jeff Winton, but now I'm contacting you as a grieving uncle and as a rural dairy farmer in upstate New York. What are you doing for the 46 million people who live in rural America? 14% of our population. And basically, almost every question that I asked was met with a very respectful silence and an admission that they weren't really doing a lot focused exclusively on rural America, because the fact remained they didn't necessarily know how to reach people like my family. They didn't know how to go about doing this. And so it was with the support and with the encouragement of some of these other large mental health nonprofit organizations that we were launched 3.5 years ago. And they're now our partners, and we're working very closely and very collaboratively with them. And we're really focused right now on storytelling, because we are a national organization. And even though we're based at my dairy farm in upstate New York on the beautiful shores of Lake Erie, I travel around the country almost nonstop. And that's why I said I'm in Chicago right now. And no matter where I am in this big, vast, beautiful country, I hear similar stories. But unfortunately, these stories are hidden, and they're not always told in the way that they need to be told, because the fact remains the stigma surrounding mental illness, especially in rural areas, is still alive and well. People in rural America don't necessarily consider mental illness to be an illness. Now, we all know it's an illness, but all too often, people consider it to be a character flaw or a personality weakness. I mean, those of you who grew up on a farm like I did, you know, we're taught from the time we're young kids to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, to not talk about our issues, to not make other people uncomfortable with what we might be suffering from. And as a result, we have this growing epidemic in rural America where there's a 65% more likelihood that people in rural America will die by suicide than in urban and suburban areas. Young people that grow up in rural areas are 54% more likely to die by suicide than their urban counterparts. So we've got a growing epidemic, and one that we are doing our best to tackle as a young and small organization. But we're very encouraged after what we've seen after the last 3.5 years. And this is why I start almost every talk I give with my family story, because we have to humanize this. We have to put a personal face on mental illness in rural America. And there's many factors that we don't have time to go into now that many of you know as to why we have a disproportionate number of people living with mental illness in rural areas compared to urban and suburban areas. And you've already heard from other speakers. It's the decline of some of these small towns we all live in. It's the closure of rural hospitals. It's the lack of access. And while telemedicine, as the last speaker said, is certainly helping many people in rural America, the fact remains that 30% of families in rural America have no broadband because it's not available. It's not that they can't afford it, it's not available. So we have a growing issue across the land. And what concerns me is these are the future of agriculture. These people, our young people, are the ones who will be raising our food and our fiber in the next generation. And so if we don't do something about this before it's too late, we will be in bigger trouble than we are right now in rural America. But I am encouraged that younger people, as many of you know, are much more likely to talk about tough topics, such as mental illness, than certainly my generation is. And that's what gives me great hope. And Rural Minds is in the process of launching a rural mental health youth program that will be focused on both suicide ideation, substance use disorder, and mental illness among young people that live and work in rural America. I would encourage all of you to go to our website, which is ruralminds.org. We have a quite robust gathering of information there. We do a series of webinars that you can find archived on there. We're also very active in most social media platforms. Our new newsletter, I just proofed this morning before I got on this call, that's going out. We would ask you to go to our website and sign up for that. But we would ask you to be part of this movement that my mother unknowingly started in that small town United Methodist pastor's office when, because of her courage and her candor, said, "We will not let my grandson die in vain. We are going to talk about this." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you for sharing your family's story and for the work that you're doing to help rural communities. I'll point out that Rural Minds recently became a member of the Farm Family Wellness Alliance, which is a coalition that Farm Foundation has built over the past 5 years, and we provide unlimited mental health services to all farm families in America. There's a program called Together All, which is an online community where folks can share their stories, they can help each other out, they can give advice. And what we have found remarkably, Jeff, is that that anonymous online community is reaching an audience that is more difficult to reach, and that is males my age, between 45 and 65. They are our predominant user on Together All. And that gives me a lot of hope that that format in particular is finding an audience, and an audience that needs that support. But Jeff, I'll start by asking you the first question, to say, what do you think keeps people from finding or knowing when they need that mental health support? And I would say I love the idea that you shared, that illness is not a weakness. I think that's so important. But back to the question, what keeps folks from seeking help?
Well, the thing that we are learning, again, as we get further and further into this work and travel around the country, again, goes back to the stigma that people do not consider mental illness to be an illness. And so they're ashamed of it. And we talk openly about cancer. We talk openly about heart disease. We certainly talk openly about COVID and diabetes, but we don't talk openly about schizophrenia or major depression or alcohol use disorder because we are embarrassed. And, growing up many years ago on that farm, both of my grandmothers sadly had colon cancer at the same exact time when they were both only 60 years old. And I remember back then, people weren't willing to talk about cancer. So we've come a long ways, and a large part of that has been because of the patient advocacy that cancer groups like Susan G. Komen and Cancer Care and those organizations have put out into the universe. So we are hoping to do the same by dragging mental illness out of the darkness of the recesses of rural America to get people to talk about them in the same manner they talk about other illnesses that clearly impact those of us who live in small towns and on farms.
Great, terrific, thank you. So I have a question that I'd like to start off with to ask each of our panelists, and that's what gives you hope? What excites you about the future of rural communities? I will start by sharing I'm excited by the fact that people who didn't grow up on farms and didn't grow up in rural communities really want to do it. They want to move there. They want to become farmers. They want to revitalize communities. As I mentioned, my own community post-COVID saw a huge influx of people moving from the city of Chicago. And now on Saturday mornings, the amount of baby carriages in our downtown is remarkable. And that's a wonderful thing. And that's what really gives me hope. But Sochil, maybe I'll start with you and you can tell us what gives you hope.
It is so true. What gives me hope is the resilience of rural communities. Just recognizing how many challenges we've overcome, whether it was farm crisis in the 80s, whether it was COVID. And each time, ag has been incredibly adaptive to responding to those challenges, finding ways to, again, invest in in smaller markets, connecting to regional markets in the midst of COVID, building networks of support when it came to the farm crisis in the 1980s. And so I feel inspired by the continuing work that's happening in rural places and hopeful that there can be support for that through real intentionality in that diversification of production and the recognition that different types of operations will help build that resilience.
Terrific. Alan?
Yeah, two quick ones. One, in first and foremost, looking at the census data, this concept that rural is somehow dying off or moving away. Rural adjacent to urban is the fastest growing geographic region in the United States today, and rural nationwide has held its own for the last decade. So I think with the changing nature of being able to work where you want to work, more people are choosing to be where they want to be, which happens oftentimes to be rural communities. Number one. Number two, directly to healthcare, looking at the national data on primary care and general surgery shows that rural healthcare actually has higher, better quality standards than urban areas. So I think this misnomer that somehow rural healthcare is second tier or less than just isn't backed up by the data.
Right. Terrific. Julia?
So Shil, that was great. You were so eloquent. So I support everything that you said. I think for me, when I look at rural, I see sort of two trends happening. There's some rural communities where you really have this depopulation thing happening, and they're getting smaller and smaller, and those are the ones that I'm worried about. And then they're the ones where they're actually growing because people are, thanks maybe to COVID or telecommuting or whatever, there are more people, younger people coming into communities and wanting to live there. That can create threats to agriculture too, but it also creates a lot more energy within communities. So to me, what I get excited about is really getting communities together to chart their future and really thinking about it and feeling like they're empowered to do it. It happens a lot in urban America. Urban America has planners. Rural America generally doesn't. People who serve in so-called planning capacity usually aren't planners by trade. They don't have the skills about visioning and bringing people together to sort of create the future that they want. So for me, I get excited when I get to sit down in a group of people and go through establishing shared values, shared visions, shared goals, so that we can actually get where communities want to go. That's what rocks my boat, rocks my boat.
That's great. Thank you. Jeff?
So our dairy farm in upstate New York is actually in a resort area. So we have a number of ski resorts in the area, but we're also in one of the two grape producing areas. So we've got a number of wineries, and the Chautauqua Institution is there, and a lot of places where people had historically had second homes. But once COVID hit, and many of these people that had second homes in our area were from New York City, we're from Pittsburgh, we're from Toronto, we're from Cleveland. And all of a sudden they said, we can work remotely now. We can do our job from anywhere. So we are going to move to our second homes year round. I just met a woman, believe it or not, after the winter we had. I just met a woman who sold her house in Hawaii to move year round to Western New York, where, again, we historically get a lot of snow. And she said it's because I love being in an agricultural area. I love the slower pace. Of course, the cost of living is much lower than in Hawaii. But what gives me great hope is I've met a lot of people like her that know what good looks like. These are people that have experienced, life in a more urban area. In many cases, these are people that are politically active. And so they're changing the political landscape in our rural farming community to get people more engaged, especially in light of a lot of the changes taking place right now. But it's really infused a tremendous sense of energy and enthusiasm into the area. Now, the flip side, someone mentioned a moment ago, is that it is driving up the cost of real estate. And so a lot of the farms, including some of the farms near mine, have gone on the market, and other local farmers would have loved to have bought them, but they were competing with wealthy people from urban areas who have decided to move out there. So that's where, it's a double-edged sword, certainly. But I think all in all, for us, it's a very positive thing. We're seeing new restaurants and a lot of new things pop up that we wouldn't have seen normally.
Right. Terrific. I'm going to ask a question from Del Craig. Del is a producer in Indiana, and he was asking about the growth of solar fields and the consumption of, particularly in Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, of beautiful flat farmland, cleared land being used for energy production. I often think that the future of farming is two things. One is the increase of energy production, both in crops and in solar fields, and then the diversification and smaller farms on the other side. But are there opportunities? We all certainly have a lot of concerns about the growth of solar, but does anyone have thoughts about opportunities that may exist around it? There's a lot of talk about agrivoltaics, so you growing crops in or around solar fields, or small animal production, particularly sheep, seem to be well suited for that environment. But I've recently had a conversation about rabbits. But anybody have thoughts about that?
Tim, I'll take the first stab, and then if anyone wants to add to it, I think there's um, a visceral response when you drive by a farm or a field that you're used to seeing every single day, and it changes. And sometimes that change is solar, and it's a competing goals that you're working to fight, right? We want affordable, clean power that will, help address the continuing challenges with the climate. But we know we need to sustain farmland. First thing I want to acknowledge is just that we are losing farmland to all sorts of things. And I know Julia can add to this, but one of the biggest places where we're losing farmland is data centers. We've certainly seen a lot of that all across the West, as well as development, particularly of luxury homes, as people seek to live in these beautiful places. And there's just a higher cost for development. The thing with solar is I think there are actual tools that can be used to help lessen the pressure when it comes to the development specifically in that area. The first is, when rural development received historic investments through the New Era program, we're working with rural electric cooperatives to help expand their affordable, clean energy, resilient energy. We included a few requirements. So one of them was putting together a farm benefit plan that was specifically asking them to think strategically, one, about how to deploy and where to deploy, but two, how those deployments could also support ag operations through opportunities like agrivoltaics or putting up solar, having a portion of their plan be distributed solar and supporting farmers who are putting up solar on their barns. But looking at those impacts beforehand was crucial. And then, the agrivoltaics, we talked about that as an opportunity, and also looking at places where if you take a portion of land and turn it into a solar field, how that might support nearby farms through a cooperative model, for example. The last thing I'll say is I'll explain how one of those how that can work. So I visited a farm that it was a nursery that used to be an outdoor nursery, and it was incredibly challenging to operate, especially in the winter. And so the farmer wanted to transition to a inside nursery with a greenhouse, but he needed the capital to do so. So he ended up taking out a loan for a solar installation that then supplied the power for that nursery and allowed him to operate much more efficiently, keeping his family farm in operation while also was creating a reliable power supply. So there are ways to make it happen. The question is, are we doing it intentionally, and how can we support really in intentional local zoning codes, for example, to navigate these challenges?
Great, thank you. Julie, do you have some thoughts?
So AFT has developed a series of smart solar principles. But I was trying to put it into the Q&A and I couldn't figure out how to do it. So maybe we can send that out afterwards. But for me, it's really important to find that balance between the need, all the different social needs, right? Which is, I'm a planner by trade, so I like planning. Affordable housing is a huge need, right? The easiest, fastest place, cheapest place to develop affordable housing is on prime farmland, right? So too with solar, so too with warehouses, another big threat. So too with data centers, which are consuming enormous amounts of land. So we always have this competition for land and land use conflicts. And it's really important for communities to say, this is where we want our solar or our housing or whatever to go. And this is the farmland we really, really want to keep in active agricultural production, right? So if communities go through that process, it really helps. Where I am in New England, right, we have a lot of hilly, rocky soil. We don't have a lot of, nationally significant agricultural land, right? It makes a lot of sense. And we have smaller operations to build, solar into farming operations where, again, you can run sheep underneath. I was working in Wayne County, Ohio, where they have, it's Corn Belt, 1,000-acre, multi-1,000-acre farms. You put solar on that, good luck finding markets for sheep who run underneath that, right? So you really have to look at all of it in the context of, what's the quality of your land? How is the solar being installed? When you do agrivoltaics, it's more expensive because you have to make the panels up higher. Balancing all of those things to get to win-win. So again, a pitch for community level planning and community development.
Terrific. Any other thoughts? All right. And so the rabbit example that I gave was someone was arguing that they are a quick source of protein. It's lean protein and really requires few inputs. But the problem is, of course, as Americans have not eaten rabbit as a normal protein probably for a century. And so how do we get folks to appreciate it?
So I have to say, when I first moved to Western Massachusetts, there were signs all over that said meat pets. And I was like, what does that mean? It was rabbits. It was people raising rabbits for meat or for pets. So maybe
Right.
not 100 years, Tim.
Maybe not.
Depends on
Maybe
where
not.
you are. And
Yes.
certainly when we think about food security, I think rabbits probably have a role in that future, right? As a faster, cheaper way of getting protein into people's diets.
Right, absolutely. So there are a couple of questions about broadband access, and I know Sochil, you've worked on this some. From the Obama administration through the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, there were tremendous investments in rural broadband. So, can you give us your thoughts on sort of where we stand with that and what else needs to be done?
Yeah, this is something that's exceptionally personal to me. When I was in Congress, it felt like every week was supposed to be infrastructure week, and yet throughout the length of the first Trump administration, we didn't get an infrastructure package through, despite real focus to do so. And so when I came on as Undersecretary for Rural Development in the Biden administration, I was really excited about the bipartisan infrastructure law and the work that was done to invest in high-speed internet all across the country. And one of the key decisions, and frankly, it was a compromise that Congress made in order to invest in high-speed internet, was to put the bulk of the money, actually not in rural development, where we were very efficient at getting out the funds into infrastructure right away, but to the states, so that the states would have their own discretion in terms of figuring out how and where they wanted to invest. And so that took a little more time to create the right maps to deliver those those funds in a fair way. But it gave states the opportunity to prioritize what they felt was most important. And a lot of states decided they wanted to double down on fiber, specifically because it's a technology that you can build upon for the future. It's easier to then ramp up speeds as needs adapt. Unfortunately, in this current administration, there's been actually a decision to take away that discretion from the states and supporting certain technologies over others, specifically satellite companies that that specific business partners may benefit from. And so I think this is a real challenge for states' rights in terms of their ability to determine how, cutting through mountains to provide high-speed internet in New Mexico might look different than lining a cable down the seafloor to reach Alaska, and all of the challenges in between that it was decided that states really needed the ability to make those decisions.
Great. Anybody else want to talk about broadband? All right, terrific. So Jeff and Alan, this question would be for you. A person is interested in learning how to get involved at the policy intersection of agriculture and healthcare. They're currently involved in community and public health. So what would you advise them to do?
Well, I may take the lead on that. You only need to remember the words rural health. Google, Yahoo, Bing, rural health. You're going to come upon our website. Love to have you as a member, but we have tons of tools and resources just free. We just love to get you engaged, and click on the top where it says policy, and you can find out how to get engaged. You can find tons of policy papers that our membership have done and other opportunities to both engage at the local, state, and federal level.
I would add that from our standpoint with Rural Minds, because again, we're a new organization, we hadn't necessarily expected to be getting so involved in policy matters so early in our formation. But in light of things happening right now in our government, we've been forced to, which is not a bad thing. So we've brought on our first policy person who is helping us to address the ramifications of many decisions on the mental health of people that live in rural America. So our ask is to have people again share their stories and what is impacting them and their families, and to talk more openly about this. Our website, again, ruralminds.org, has a lot of toolkits, a lot of other resources for people to utilize so that they can put on community meetings. We're working very closely with the grains, with the cattlemen's, with the soybean association, with the wheat growers, a lot of the agricultural organizations, but we're also working with Pfizer and Merck and Johnson & Johnson and NAMI and a lot of the other nonprofits in mental health. So you mentioned the intersection of healthcare and agriculture. that's very much where we find ourselves right now in the rural mental health space. And I must say, we've created a partnership council, which just met yesterday. They meet on a quarterly basis. And the first meeting we had, which was again 3.5 years ago, brought together people from the healthcare industry, both nonprofit and for profit, and from agriculture, both for profit and nonprofit. And it was solely focused on mental health and what we needed to do to advance this agenda. And it was the first time that many of these companies had ever been at the same table together. And even though people were off doing their own thing and had very well-intended actions and strategies for how they wanted to reach this, they were doing it in a vacuum. They were doing it on their own. And when all of a sudden they realized that, geez, someone that's living with bipolar disorder is probably also buying John Deere tractors and is sending his milk to a co-op, we need to look at the people in rural America holistically, not just as someone living with bipolar disorder or not just someone who is a farmer. And so we have seen the power of bringing together, arguably these two very important and powerful industries for the advancement of the work that we're doing.
Terrific. Thank you. So a common question, both in the chat and across the country right now is what the effects of the current immigration policies are going to be on rural communities across the country. I think, Sochi, you were talking about, sort of the role of the immigrants and what they bring to these communities. So any thoughts that you have on what these current policies, how they're going to affect these communities?
Yeah, last October, I was in Michigan talking with apple farmers, and the only topic they wanted to talk about was about their workforce. Being able to have a consistent, regular supply of farm workers was fundamental and was the biggest threat to their livelihood into the future. And as we look at what it takes to have that consistent, reliable labor force, one of the key things is that certainty. And that's why working towards comprehensive immigration reform and specifically around agricultural workforce is crucial. When I was in Congress, I was really proud to vote for and co-sponsor the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. It passed the House and then languished in the Senate. And then, this Congress, it hasn't passed at all. Last Congress, it didn't pass at all. And so it's just deeply frustrating to see a solution that's been carved out, frankly, really hashed out between where you've got support from one of the most prominent farm worker unions, as well as support from a lot of different farm groups, and to see it not come to fruition is pretty frustrating. But now we're seeing that uncertainty being taken to a whole nother level when it comes to deportation threat. Just this last week, we saw an about face where first the administration was going to focus on deportations and specifically looking at agricultural communities. Then there was a potential statement that, okay, maybe we're going to back off and we're going to treat farm workers different from everyone else. We're not going to go onto farms. And then just the other day, it came back that actually, no, we're going back onto the farms. And when that comes to the, families that are trying to navigate this, families, maybe a few of them are documented, but they have parents perhaps who are caretakers who aren't documented. That makes everyone scared to show up for work and creates a real crunch both for those families, those individuals, as well as the farmers trying to harvest crops.
Any other thoughts about that from the rest of the group?
Anecdotally, I'll share a story that was shared with me 2 weeks ago. I got a call from a large dairy farm over in the Finger Lakes area of New York State, and they milk several thousand cows, and so obviously employ a very large workforce. And they said that practically overnight, they lost the bulk of their workers, including their documented workers, that they are so concerned now that they decided that they weren't going to stay around and become a target. And obviously, a farm that's milking 6,800 cows or whatever the herd size was is highly mechanized, but somebody still has to run the machines and do a lot of other things. And so we are very concerned about the impact it's having. I talked to a produce farmer over in California who, again, very similar situation, who, find the fruits and vegetables rotting on the vines right now because people have disappeared. So it's something that greatly concerns me. And as a mental health advocate, as Soshi said, just the ups and downs of what is being done by the administration. First, we're okay, then we're not okay, then we're okay. That's having a tremendous impact, as you would imagine, on the mental well-being of the farm families who are trying to hang in there and make sense of this as we go through this uncertainty.
I would just wrap around on this and yeah, the issue of immigration and the issue of Medicaid. Healthcare concerns, they don't just magically go away if you don't address them. And so anytime you're putting barriers that would prevent people from going to see their primary care clinician when they're starting to see an issue, they end up ending in the emergency room, which is the most expensive care possible, puts even more burdens on the local hospital to try to keep their doors open. So it actually puts at risk that access point for the entire rural community. And it's a direct connection of having how can your hospital stay there for you, depending on whether or not the Medicaid patients can see regular visits to the hospital and whether we have a potential barrier to immigrants seeing this as well too.
So Ellen, on that, with Medicare, there's a lot of reports now that if the Medicare cuts that are in the current big beautiful bill go through, that more than half of rural hospitals will close. Do you feel that's accurate?
Yeah, because I mentioned earlier, with half of the rural hospitals operating at a loss, by cutting Medicaid, you are going to close rural hospitals. There's a lot in the media that may close rural hospitals. That's inaccurate. It will close rural hospitals. In fact, yesterday we had a national report that was released, which indicated that if the cuts go through as proposed in Congress right now, rural hospitals are going to lose 21 cents on every Medicaid dollar. That's a total of $70 billion over 10 years. I think any rational person would realize you're not going to have rural hospitals open when you're taking out potentially $70 billion from their bottom line.
Julia, this might be a great question for you, but are there different approaches for small farms and economic development in rural areas versus what might be described as peri-urban areas, rural, yet in close proximity to large metropolitan areas?
Yes. I think the easy answer is yes. If you have access to a large population base, a lot of direct-to-consumer marketing makes a lot of sense. If you're in a rural community, right, and especially a rural community that's experienced depopulation, doing a farmer's market or a CSA probably does not make as much sense as it would if you're in a peri-urban kind of area. There, you're going to need to look more at things like cooperatives and finding regional markets instead of sort of smaller, closer to you local markets, right? It's really, you still, I think, want to make sure that your community gets fed, like what you see a lot in, like I've actually worked in southern New Mexico, right, where you'll have like a lot of, well, they're peppers, but also say a lot of pecans being grown, and they're all being shipped out. Everything's being shipped to global markets, right? Well, you could keep some of that in the community and find a way to build some wealth and recycle some. Maybe it's your seconds, and you do some value-added processing. Like I think you're going to need more infrastructure for processing and sort of recycling within the community, and also looking more at regional markets rather than at things like farmers markets or CSAs, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think you would definitely want to have different kinds of strategies.
Great.
And so you might want to jump in on that as well.
I love the call out both to New Mexico chili as well as New Mexico pecans. They are world class both. I'll actually, being fair, call out Texas as well. I was visiting with a CSA in the Fort Worth area, and they were really working on supporting urban farming. But what they found is that a lot of the new farmers didn't have the skills that they needed to be successful and to produce a reliable crop. So the CSA ended up reaching out to regional farms that were generational farms with a lot of expertise. And so the farmers in the surrounding area provided some technical assistance to the urban farmers where the skills were translatable, but then also were able to gain access to that CSA with the larger Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Great. A recent farmer-led letter with 750 signers from every state in the U.S. asked the USDA to prioritize diversification to enhance economic and environmental sustainability. What do you all think the USDA can do to better support diversification in the ag system?
I'll put one comment in. So Jenny Lesser-Moffett was the undersecretary for MRP. She's now at AFT, so big shout out there. But one of her main focuses throughout the Biden administration was getting these food hubs all across the country. Because as we've talked about, when it comes to diversification, one of the crucial things is knowing the specifics of the area. Where are the places? Where are the markets? Where are the opportunities? How can you do more value-added agriculture in a way that will sell? And so that's why that technical assistance is so important all across the country, to be able to provide that very specific investment. So I think that's one thing that unfortunately we're not seeing being continued through this administration in the same way with the same intensity, and is certainly a crucial part of the puzzle.
Anybody else want to talk about that? So I know we rely a lot on the federal farm bill, but I would like to point out Pennsylvania was a state that has its own farm bill, and I think has been particularly strategic in how they look at the map of their state on where they produce food, how they support those producers, and what infrastructure can be created or incentivized by the state in order to help producers in a region sort of build their own cooperative communities. And I think that's such an innovative and thoughtful way for states to react, and not just simply relying on action from the federal government and USDA, just as an alternative idea. Julia, there was a question specifically for you. It says you talked about achievable outcomes for rural communities. Can you provide some examples of outcomes?
Yeah, so a lot of it would be, depending on the community, but making that connection between, if a community says we want to incentivize more local production for local consumers, making sure that they then follow that up with policies that encourage that. So, many rural communities have policies that say we want to support agriculture, but really what they're talking about is sort of traditional, more commodity kind of agriculture. And so when you introduce other ideas, and this would be especially for, communities that are experiencing, saying, more urbanizing pressures, right? And they want to have an agritourism kind of operation or something. The community will say, that's not agriculture. That doesn't qualify for the incentives or whatever supports we give to our producers here. So to me, the outcomes can be changing your local zoning so that you make it what I call farm friendly. So instead of zoning just being, this is how many houses you can have per acre, right? Which is kind of traditional zoning. It would be zoning and local ordinances that say, yes, you can diversify, you can do value-added processing on your farm. You can do that methane digester that's using your manure, right? You can put solar panels on your barns, like all those kinds of things. So it can be energy production, it can be value-added food production, it can be all those things. And so to me, a lot of those outcomes come in the process to get the community to support its ag industry as businesses, as local businesses that are driving wealth creation in the community. And then for each one, it's going to be different. But a lot of the experiences that I've had has been where you end up actually changing local policies and zoning codes and things like that, like in order to achieve the outcomes that the community has laid out for the direction that they want to go. Can also be investment in public infrastructure. So cooling facilities or packing facilities, or a food hub, or, creating new slaughter capacity if you have a viable livestock industry, so you're not shipping your animals really far away. Like all of that kind of investment can come as really concrete outcomes after a community development or planning process.
Terrific. Jeff and Alan, this question would be for you. Are you aware of any programs focused on farm child safety? They shared a statistic that said one child is killed every 3 days on a farm in the US. Anything you can share around that?
Yeah, I may take the lead on that. AgriSafe is a nationally federally funded organization that provides educational assistance both for the public and for providers of how to operate safely on family farms.
Terrific. Jeff, anything to add there?
Yeah, all I would say is we're focused right now on mental well-being, and I shared some statistics during my portion of the talk, but we're now partnering with the 4-H, with FFA, with the youth from the Grange, a lot of the other established youth organizations to get our content out there because they already have the infrastructure. They're already in rural America, and it's a matter now of having them embrace what we're doing. And in fact, they're doing that from the mental health angle.
Great. So, what skills do you see urban and rural farmers lacking that may limit their access to larger markets, such as food safety, traceability, or modern growing practices? That's a great question. And any thoughts on that?
Baha, that is such a fantastic question. Thanks for putting it in the chat. And you mentioned many of them. Another one that I would add is if they want to add value, if farmers are looking to add value to their crop, organic can be a great way to do that, to charge a higher price, get a fairer share of their food dollar. But the organic process can be really difficult. So one of the things that Secretary Vilsack worked along with Jenny Lester Moffitt to develop was training opportunities specifically for agricultural farmers that were looking to transition to organic production, and so that makes a huge difference. The other thing, when we talked about creating local and regional markets, that takes a lot of investment and time to build a supply, a reliable supply, and so certainly some of that is food safety and getting that training. It's also, working with small farmers to make sure they have cooling available right on the farm so that increases the quality when it arrives to the final location. Some of these other things that when you're part of a larger system, there's an easy map on how to navigate, but when you're trying to set up your own shop, it can be a little more difficult. I'll also use your question to get a few more chips off the table that I left from the last question. When it comes to diversifying your operation, there's no one I've seen more visionary on this than Secretary Vilsack in his whiteboard speech, where he talked about all the different ways that farmers can look at different markets to develop, whether it's climate smart practices, where you have customers who are specifically seeking that out and willing to pay more for it, whether it's, producing energy as well as the wind turbine on your ranch, so you have consistent, reliable energy, like you saw with the quilt block power with Dairyland's power up in Wisconsin, that's providing that reliable, sustainable energy and resources to a rancher, as well as so they can go through the cattle cycle and get through it. But for all of these, it takes that training to be able to, and that initial capital investment, as well as skills to be able to access those markets.
Terrific. So I think to wrap up, I just have one last question, and that's any last thoughts? And so Sheila, I hate to put you on the spot, but since you're featured right here on my screen, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Thank you so much. You asked us at the beginning what makes us hopeful. And I have to admit, this conversation is going to be something that I'll keep coming back to in terms of what makes me hopeful, to see the level of interest of people who are attending this conversation, but also the expertise. Jeff, you talked about getting people with lots of different perspectives all at the table to solve a common challenge. And that's what I feel like this conversation has also been. And I'll end that I talked about Schuyler, Nebraska, and I didn't talk about that Guatemalan shop. The owner of that shop ended up going because a USDA-funded program provided her with computer skills because she'd gone to a bank and tried to get a job. They said she didn't have the skills. So she went and got the skills. And then she got a microloan to open that shop. So what that says to me is that when we invest in rural people, when we invest in their solutions, there's no better source of hope.
Great, thank you. That's wonderful. Jeff, can I ask you to go next?
Yes, certainly. I think that despite some of the chaos that we're all experiencing right now with the changes taking place in this country, that people are getting engaged, and people in rural America in particular, who many times have been kind of in the shadows and behind the scenes, are much more prominent and much more visible in the conversation that's taking place. And that gives me great hope as I travel across this country.
Great, terrific. Julia?
Yeah, so I think to sort of lift up those themes, it is getting people to the table with different perspectives, right? So I've dealt a little bit with health in terms of sort of rural America and agriculture, but it's usually in terms of just making sure that people know how to get access to healthcare rather than the hospital issue, which I read about and I know is profoundly affecting rural communities. And so it was really exciting to hear, well, even though I keep following the news of how we're losing all these rural hospitals, at least there's some innovation and there's some solutions and there's some hope there. And that was something that I didn't know going in. So to me, being part of these conversations, bringing people together to have these conversations is really exciting because I like to learn something new every day. And I feel like today I learned a lot of new things. So that was really exciting. And thank you, Tim.
Thank you so much, Julia. And Alan, I'll let you go next.
I always love when a panel gets together and the discussion mirrors what the national surveys and data shows. And there's this narrative going on that somehow rural people are left behind or forgotten. And that's not what the data shows. People choose rural. And I don't think we do a good enough job of emphasizing that there are great things happening in rural, and there's a decision point being made that people love the rural community, they love the sense of community, love family, they love the environment, and we just need to do a better job telling our story.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the panelists for this really wonderful discussion today. And thank you to everybody in the audience for joining and submitting questions. But also there was a vibrant discussion going on and sharing of resources. And I absolutely love seeing that. So thank you so much. We appreciate this engagement so much with us. And we'd love to hear your feedback. So please take a moment to share your comments about today's session in the survey that will be sent to you at the close of this forum. A very special thank you again to the American Farmland Trust for their partnership in today's forum. We're very grateful for their collaboration and their shared commitment to advancing agricultures and rural communities. If you'd like to continue to help us providing this valuable programming like today's forum, I'll just remind you about becoming a friend of Farm Foundation. You can check the link in the chat and learn more about that. Each and every gift helps Farm Foundation strengthen our ability to address rapidly evolving issues impacting agriculture, the food system, and rural communities. And we're grateful for your support. So once again, thanks to everybody for joining today, and we'll now conclude this forum.